Let me get to slideshow. All right. So I want to say a couple things before I really get going here. First of all, it's really great to see so many of my Ohio friends. I've enjoyed seeing some of you at tournaments over the course of the season so far, and I look forward to seeing you more as we move toward states. I'm also really happy to see so many of my colleagues from CDC. It's really, really great to see you all, and I hope that your year is going very well. Um, I want to real quick before we get into this framework issue, I want to talk just a little bit about one of the pillars of CDC, which is pluralism. So, just counting up the experience of the people who are here as instructors, there's probably about 100 years of debate experience combined among all of us, right? And one of the things you're going to find is that even though we have so much experience, either as longtime coaches or as instructors or as debaters, um, we're not all going to agree. You're going to get many different perspectives from us, right? And you're going to find out that, some of the things that Danielle said, I'm going to give you a slightly different perspective, and that's okay. We're not even going to agree on how to pronounce unclos, right? So, what we want you to do is take from this whole 2-day session what is valuable to you. Don't feel that you have to agree with every single thing that's presented to you. Don't feel that you have to implement every single thing that's presented to you. We want you to take what's valuable to you and become stronger debaters from that. Over the course of this presentation, I want you to feel free to ask questions. So just raise your hand on screen, and we'll get into that. Okay. So here is what we're going to be talking about in this session. I want to address what is different about this topic, because it's a very, very different topic. I think that even those of us who have been involved in Lincoln Douglas debate for a long, long time, we've never seen a topic like this. Some mistakes to avoid. I want to talk about the framework debate, and then some potential affirmative frameworks and strategies, and then some negative frameworks and strategies. Okay. All right. So what's different about this topic? So first of all, the obvious, right? There's a proposal of specific plans in this resolution. This is straight out of the policy world. And I'm really glad that Danielle and Sean are going to talk about the perspective from policy debate right after this, because it's going to be very helpful to you. This isn't something unusual, but it's something that you should pay attention to, is that there's a clear specification of the United States as the actor in this resolution, right? This is from a particularly United States perspective, right? This does not say what should France do or what should Chile do, right? This is specifically about the United States. The big strange thing for a lot of us has been the use of and or in the resolution, right? And I think Danielle hinted at this a little bit, but you need to understand what and or means from a logical perspective, right? Uh, First of all, as Danielle said, it gives the affirmative the freedom to argue in support of UNCLOS, in support of ICC, or in support of both, right? Um, but the affirmative also has the freedom to argue from a higher ground, right? The idea that the United States should approach its international commitments in a specific way, in a certain way, right? And Danielle used the word globalism. I'm going to use that term too. Um, and that, these two particular treaties are examples that illustrate the approach that the United States should take, right? So the United States should not embrace one of these treaties just on their own merits, but because of what it means for the United States and the rest of the world. And then the negative, as was said earlier, has to be able to debate whatever affirmative affirms, right? The negative has to be prepared for anything. And I fully agree with Danielle when she says that the judge is voting on the resolution. They're not voting on a particular debater. Okay. So it's who has persuaded me that their world under their side of the resolution is a better world. Okay. And that's what, to me, it means to vote the resolution. So here's some things I want you to stay away from. This is not public forum debate. Okay. So even though these two pieces of policy that are proposed are highly specific, don't be tempted to get into heavy detailed analysis of the nitpicky details of one aspect or another, right? Like things like cost benefit analyses and things like that, right? Going deeply into economic impacts for the United States, I think would be a mistake. That would be a public forum thing to do. I don't think it's a Lincoln Douglas thing to do in this particular case. Don't ignore the framework. Don't like focus so much on contention level analysis that you ignore the framework, because I think that actually the framework is really the most important aspect of debating a topic like this. Because as we'll get into in a minute, the framework is going to allow you to establish what kind of world you're envisioning, right? And which world would be better. Remember that Lincoln Douglas is a competing worlds analysis. I don't know if you can hear my grandpuppy barking in the background. If so, I apologize. She's a little bit agitated because I'm in here with the door closed. So the framework is super, super important. Don't get bogged down in the contention level analysis at the expense of framework. This is true in any debate, but I think in particular with this topic, don't lose the framework debate, right? You establish a framework for a very particular purpose. You write a case under a framework for a very particular purpose. Of course, you want to also be able to show that you can win under your opponent's framework, but I think on this topic in particular, winning the framework debate will be very important. Don't make your warrants hyper-specific to UNCLOS or ICC. Again, I think that's because this debate is really about the sort of world we want to create. And UNCLOS and ICC are parts of that world or not parts of that world from the United States perspective, right? So really focus on the type of world you want to create. And don't ignore the framework level impacts, right? So what I'm going to say later on is I want you to keep circling back to your framework, right? I want you to keep going back and reminding the judge, we get more justice by affirming, and this is how we get more justice by affirming, right? Things like that. Okay. So here's framework at the highest level. I think, and again, this is my opinion as a coach, I don't think the central question is specific to UNCLOS or ICC. I think this resolution is about the role of the United States in the global community of nations, right? In the simplest analysis, I think that what the United States or what this question is asking is, should the United States enter into broad treaties to enhance global collaboration, right? Or should the United States act to maintain an advantageous position for itself by avoiding participation in such treaties? I think that this opens the door to talking about some other treaties as well, right? So, for example, you can potentially argue that the United States avoidance of entering into treaties like UNCLOS, like ICC, like the Paris Climate Accords, okay, weakens the position of the United States as a global leader. Okay. And these are examples. So this is why we have to get involved in this, because it actually strengthens the position of the United States as a global leader. Okay. So those are possibilities. All right. So here's a couple overarching ideas. And this is on the affirmative, right? And Danielle already mentioned globalism, right? The definition of globalism is the policy of placing the interest of the entire world above those of individual nations, right? So a globalist perspective says that any decision that a nation makes should be based on how it will impact not itself, but the community of nations. Okay? Internationalism is slightly different. Okay? Internationalism talks about more about political and economic cooperation among states and nations, right? So internationalism can be a little bit more self-serving. Internationalism can allow nations to get benefit for themselves in addition to making the world better by having a collaborative relationship, right? But internationalism does not necessarily demand that the United States, for example, put the entire world ahead of itself. Okay. An internationalist perspective would allow the United States to participate in some sorts of treaties, but not others. Okay. Questions on that? All right. So negative, a couple of terms you have to understand is the first one is hegemony. Those of you who are juniors and seniors, I'm guessing that you know what hegemony is. Those of you who are ninth and 10th graders, you may not have encountered the idea of hegemony before. So hegemony is basically dominance, right? It's the predominance of one state over other states, either regional or global, right? So it's leadership for advantage, right? It's not leadership for some altruistic purpose. It's leadership because we get an advantage out of it, right? So the United States, right, is considered to be the Western Hemisphere hegemon. The United States has hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, right? And that enables the United States to have certain privileges and powers within the Western Hemisphere that benefit the United States. Okay. And then the other one is national sovereignty, right? The idea that no nation can tell another nation what to do. Okay. And that the United States should never be subject to decisions of other nations. And if you look at the posture of the United States in other treaty organizations that it belongs to, you will see that the United States often keeps national sovereignty at the very forefront. So, for example, in the NATO agreement, and you know that the United States is a member of NATO, which is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was formed after World War II to ensure or to protect the Western Hemisphere against the spread of what was then the Soviet Empire. Okay. In the NATO documents pertaining to the United States, it specifically states that United States soldiers will not be asked to serve under the command of leadership from any other country, right? So, the United States protects the leadership of its own soldiers by saying they will only ever be under the command of United States commanders. Okay. So that is the United States protecting its national sovereignty while still participating in a treaty organization. All right. Are we okay on those ideas so far? Okay. Ninth and 10th graders, how are you feeling about all these words? It's a lot, right?
I actually think it's pretty good because in most of our novice years, there were topics about fossil fuels and also about military reductions, and there were a lot of topics related to power and hegemony that we could cross apply to this topic.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you for that. Okay. So here's a couple of ideas, okay, on the affirmative. So the idea here is, why should the United States enter into treaties such as UNCLOS and ICC? Okay. One idea would be something from the perspective of a global justice idea, right? So you could argue that holding all nations to the same standards ensures the spread of just ideals. Okay. And then by joining treaties such as UNCLOS or ICC, the US ensures its reputation as a champion of global justice, right? If you have been following the news for the last several years, and for some of you, like, you might not remember um, during the later part of the 2010s, right? So like in the 2017, 18, 19 timeframe, there was a lot of conversation about has the United States lost its position as the most moral, most just nation in the world because of some of the things that it was doing in pertaining to immigration, right? Like separating families at the border and locking up children, right? Um, the United States was taking a serious reputation hit on its leadership as being the leader in global justice. So you could argue on the affirmative that to enhance the reputation as the leader in global justice, the United States should participate in treaties such as this. Okay. Especially with respect to ICC. And then another possible avenue is life and or survival, right? So the United States has particularly avoided treaties having to do with the environment and climate change and things like that, right? So the United States, joined the Paris Accords, then got pulled out of the Paris Accords, and then rejoined the Paris Accords, and now is likely to be pulled out of the Paris Accords again. It's a very, very political thing, right? The Paris Climate Accords are all about global climate change, right? And the United States is like one of the only, or is probably the only major uh, democratic nation in the world that is not a party to the Paris Climate Accords, right? As an example, the United States doesn't tend to get into treaties that are broadly good for the global environment. The United States has no problem getting involved in economic treaties and in military treaties, right? But in things that benefit the global climate, and like, for example, you could look at the UNCLOS treaty, right? Um, which uh, you know, would benefit global oceans, right? The United States hasn't tended to get involved in that, right? And that has had significant consequences. If you followed the most recent uh, climate meetings, right, that took place just like about a month ago, you'll realize that there was no agreement on how to get to the targets for slowing global temperature increase. Okay. And that the United States absence in the leadership of that discussion and those negotiations is definitely felt. Thomas, go ahead.
So with this argument on like it's all political, do you think it would be a fair shot to talk about like what the next 4 years, especially because that's like what we know is going to happen, who's going to be in charge, what his policies are looking like? They're A lot of his policies are not very good for climate change. So do you think it's fair for us to say that like by not joining this and not becoming, we would probably become leaders of this, ideally, probably even in the AF world, like by not joining and not becoming a leader, we actually do protect the climate from our own disastrous policies that are going to be enacted.
Wow. You're a very creative guy, Thomas. I have to give you that. Your ideas are really creative and thoughtful. I think that's a hard argument to make, right? It's kind of like because by not participating in these treaties, theoretically there is no oversight of what the United States does, right? If the United States is a party to UNCLOS, right, it's kind of bound by the strictures of UNCLOS, and at least there's some sort of oversight there, right? Um, so basically, not by not being a member, okay, the United States, like the next administration has free reign to do pretty much whatever it wants, right? And there's no oversight about that. So I think it would be a hard argument to make otherwise. Danielle, my favorite person in the world, what's up?
Hey, so for value specifically, I've heard people value life, but I've never done it personally. Do you think if, for example, on app I was running the ICC, it would be wise to value just life?
So I hadn't thought of that. I think that's an interesting approach. I was thinking valuing life from the perspective of and something we hear on the national circuit a lot, right? That, you know, we're headed toward a global climate disaster. It's going to cause the extinction of the human species, right? We're going to wipe ourselves out, right? So that's kind of, you know, life and survival, what I was thinking. But I think you raise an interesting point, valuing life from the ICC. I think you would have to find a really clear way to weigh life by the US being a party to the ICC or not. But I mean, I think it's an idea that might be worth pursuing. So,
Thank you.
Ria, you're next, and then Nadia.
So if affirmative has like durability fiat and we just say like, okay, it just happens and we don't account that like Trump might not want that, then could we say that if Trump has like all these policies like basically the America First doctrine, then we could say that joining like UN close or ICC would maintain our hegemon because we're contributing to them, and that would fight off like the tariffs and like the economic, perhaps the economic downfall that a lot of economists are saying will happen. Could we say that?
So, first of all, I think you absolutely can argue that joining would allow the United States to maintain its hegemony. I also think that it is fair for you to state or observe that even though the Trump administration is not likely to do these things, that doesn't matter. I'm saying that even if they don't want to do these things, they ought to do these things anyway, because that's my duty to affirm, right?
Okay.
So, yes, Adia.
So I just wanted to ask more about how we're kind of balancing LD with PF here, because there is some aspect where we have to acknowledge a little bit of implementation. Like again, if we're arguing about how Trump would impact UNCLOS or ICC, but how do we balance that with framework? I guess I'm getting a little bit confused with what implementation arguments can we run to what extent under framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So, you know, I think that many judges will have different perspectives on how they view that. Okay. I can only
Mhm.
tell you what my perspective would be, right? I don't think that it is fair for either party to argue that there is going to be a nefarious actor here, right? That, for example, the Trump administration, okay, they're going to join this, but they're going to join it with the sole purpose of undermining the treaties, right? I
Mhm.
don't think that's fair argumentation. Um, I normally advise my debaters to stay clear of implementation arguments, right? Because uh, my personal perspective is that we take the actor at their highest ground, right? So that if we say that the United States is going to join these one of these treaty organizations, right, or going to become party to one of these things, that they are going to do it under the current structure of that treaty organization, and they're going to abide by those structures, right? And I think it's a little bit squirrely to come in and say, yeah, the Trump administration can join the ICC and then undermine it, right? And I don't think that that's really a good way to go. Does that answer your question?
A little bit. I was just more wondering, like, when we're responding to implementation arguments, can we just pull the, like, I don't want to say the classic card of, like, this is LD and not PF, but how do we engage in it in a way that it doesn't seem that we're ignoring the actual implementation argument, but still acknowledging that this is LD and we're discussing more about what we ought to do and not the actual implementation? Just like
Well,
splitting
I mean,
away from policy, if that makes sense.
yeah, you know, I think you just said that very well, right? I think you do it with some observations, right? So just like I think you're going to need an observation about what and or means, right?
Hmm.
I think it's also fair to have an observation about implementation, right? About that, you know, the ought in the resolution certainly implies that this is something that we are going to do, right? So, like for example, ought means can, right? That sort of argument. Okay. By the way, I heard a debater use ought means can as a neg argument on wealth tax this year and did a very good job with it. So I think there's room on either side, right? So the neg had an argument that ought means can, and since the United States cannot implement a wealth tax, they ought not implement a wealth tax. So you could go in that direction with this as well.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Thank
Rhea,
you.
go ahead.
So basically on the same note of like implementation, is it okay if I run like a stock unrealizable DA?
So it's okay if you run whatever you want to run, right? I'm not going to say you can't run something, okay? Um, I mean, I think that a DA like that could be interesting. Rhea, remind me where you're from.
I'm from Missouri.
Okay, I have a feeling that Missouri trends a little bit more toward the progressive side than Ohio does, right? What I'll say is that in Ohio, in LD, we see very few DA-based LD cases, right? So it depends on where you are and what works in your particular region. Okay. So yeah, I mean, try it out, right? See how it flies. You can always change. You've got 2 months on this topic, so you get to play with it, right?
I guess my question was more like my DA is about unrealization. So like the US can never achieve this because we haven't been doing it in the past. And so I wanted to know if I could kind of like do like, well, I guess you kind of answered my question already. Never mind. Thank you though.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to ask you a question back, like, what is it that the United States could never achieve?
Um, or they couldn't achieve, but they just wouldn't ever do that because of like you could talk about like the Paris Accord or anything like that. The Iran nuclear deal. There's like a bunch of other things that the US has never been wanting to join. So there's not substantial evidence that the US would be very wanting or inclined to like join these organizations or treaties.
Yeah, but I think that allows AF to argue that the world would have been better had the United States joined those organizations, right? Even though the United States did not join those organizations, they certainly should have, right? So like things like that. Okay.
Wait,
So I guess that's where I'd go, right? And the same thing might be true for this.
can I jump in?
All right. Oh, go ahead, Greta, please.
I just wanted to say I think that you're gonna run into issues just insofar as usually it's presumed that the thing happened already. Like equals can arguments, I think, are easier to do when it's the policy itself would fall through if we were to implement it. So along the lines of something with a wealth tax, if a wealth tax were to face like significant backlash and result in inefficacy, we wouldn't actually be able to reap any sort of reward for it. But that still presumes that a wealth tax was adopted, which is usually like a presumption mechanism in LD cases, is that the AF is able to say, like, if this thing were to happen, it would be good. What I think you could do with either of these two things is kind of focus on maybe either like a lack of accountability for major Western powers or like the overwhelming power associated with US hedge, and kind of go into that either the US joining these organizations wouldn't increase accountability or transparency widespread because they wouldn't effectively be able to target or hold the US accountable, or maybe go into something along the lines of like the US does engage with a lot of international organizations insofar as like either being a party or being a member, but historically we haven't carried through on a lot of promises that we've made to our international allies or to the organizations that we're associated with, and we don't face repercussions from that just because we are such a significant power in the current world order. And so I think maybe you could focus a little bit more on the way that these organizations would operate with respect to US membership, instead of kind of saying that the US would never join them in the first place.
So
I think that's a great response, and I think that's a great approach. Go ahead, Rhea, please.
So basically, like, it doesn't matter if we join them because, like, we don't have, it won't do anything, basically.
Yeah, I think that maybe you could say that, especially if it's an accountability or transparency or something like that, historically, I mean,
it's hard to hold a country like the US accountable. In the same way, it's hard to hold a country like China accountable in the current world order when countries are at the top and they have the most power and they have undue economic influence and those sorts of things. It's really difficult to enforce any sort of international action, just because there are no other powers that are able to serve as like an enforcement mechanism or a watchdog to a country that has the power breadth of the US. And so it could be something along those lines, or you could just go in and be like, even if we were to like sign on to this treaty, that's not saying that we're actually going to do anything. It doesn't mean that we're actually going to take action to make other countries more just or to enforce these things. It could just be totally performative and a signaling mechanism. And that also has no tangible impact. Signing on to a treaty without a clear plan as to how to enforce that treaty or uphold that treaty or increase justice doesn't actually do anything tangible in the long run. And so I think I would focus on the efficacy of actually joining. So becoming party, what would becoming party do? And the argument that you could make is that becoming party would either do nothing or be more detrimental, as opposed to arguing that we would never become party in the first place.
Thanks, Greta. Adia, go ahead.
Kind of expanding off of that, because I was doing a little bit of ICC research, not much, so I don't know how much these arguments have validity or not, but I do remember that someone else had brought this up, that the ICC only counts certain genocides against African countries, but they don't to other countries, and I do think that there's something to note, and this is just based off of personal experience, is that the international organizations have a tendency to charge those based off of political situations and to ignore certain genocides based off of political situations. We already see this going on in a lot of conflicts now, but this has also happened in scenarios like in India. So I was just wondering, would that be like an argument that we could run that technically, even if the United States did join the ICC, it could get away with a lot worse? Okay.
Yeah, I think you can actually use that on either side of the resolution too, right? So like for example, on the affirmative, I think you can argue that the ICC has only paid attention to Africa because African nations tend not to be the strongest political nations in the world. They certainly don't have large militaries, and they're not as big a threat to the rest of the world. So like it's easy to pick out African nations and enforce policies against African nations and against African leaders, right? But if you put the United States into the mix, right, which like kind of adds a lot of strength and a lot of power to the to the ICC, the ICC might actually get some leverage to address, for example, Israel or to address, for example, Russia, right? So like that's a possibility, right? So okay, let's move on to more specifically to neg a little bit, right? So from the negative perspective, you could argue that the US hegemony is good, right? And one of the reasons that US hegemony is good is because we have great standards for criminal justice, probably the best standards for criminal justice in the world, right? And that the world relies on US hegemony. Like the world relies on the US Navy, for example, to make the seas safe against, for example, piracy, right? The Somali pirates. Having the United States be bound by the strictures of something like UNCLOS could impair this effort, right? And that would be a very bad thing. And then there's the idea that there are aspects of both of these treaty organizations that conflict with the US Constitution, right? And so you could make a constitutionalism argument. For example, with the president being commander in chief of the US military, right? Could we, joining the ICC cause the United States president to be held accountable for US military actions, right? So that's an interesting perspective, and that is something that the U.S. has historically been very, very cautious about, right? We don't want our political decisions to be held up to global scrutiny, and our political leaders to be held up to possible criminal action. Danielle, please go ahead.
Okay, with constitutionalism, I think I saw an argument that you could do, but I don't know if it was like a smart one. I think it was talking about how it was something about like trials. I think it said something about how the ICC and UNCLOS would like, I guess, undermine the Constitution because there's some parts in it, for example, like right to the trial. Yeah, trial by jury. And could we like perchance take an approach that's like joining UNCLOS would be like unconstitutional for the United States as it puts them in like a certain position that the Constitution does not allow or disagrees with, if that makes sense.
Greta, you want to weigh in on that? Because I think you have specific knowledge with respect to at least ICC in this respect.
Yeah. So I think that there definitely is a constitutionality argument that you can make with respect, especially to the ICC. UNCLOS is a little bit different because it's not, I mean, it's not a court, it's not a legal system. And so you don't have jurisdictional contest there in the same way you do with the ICC. With the ICC, I think somebody said it in the chat, I believe the biggest one and the one that's faced the most critique is the trial by jury situation. However, there's also the US Constitution, insofar as it's trial by judges. We'll get into this. I'm lecturing on the ICC later, and so I'll talk more about this. But insofar as the US legal system has a lot of like very unique intricacies, especially when it comes to like high volume crimes, crimes committed during wartime jurisdiction in the president, and the overlap between that and our judicial system. All of that gets really complicated. End of the story is ICC jurisdiction probably does have some contest with the US Constitution. The one thing that I would say is that on that argument, if you're gonna make it, if you're gonna do a constitutionality neg, you should really just sit there and think first, like, are these provisions of the US Constitution that are contradictory to the ICC? In the situation of crimes like genocide, crimes against humanity, widespread rape, torture, terror, etc., are the constitutional provisions currently integrated into the US Constitution sufficient? Because our Constitution, while it is a core pillar of the United States government, et cetera, debate, especially on topics like this, we have to consider it from an international angle. Our Constitution isn't perfect. There's a reason it's been amended. There's a reason it's gone through amendments. There's a reason it's been edited. And there's a reason that people are still trying to change it today and will continue to try to change it into the future. And so before you make a constitutionality arg, I really would urge all of you to just sit there and think about whether or not current US procedures are sufficient to address them. Because if I was the AF debater, that's what I would go to. I'd be like, well, we can't address them sufficiently currently. That's why we need the ICC. And so I would just think through those things. That's kind of my 2 cents on it. And I'm going to talk a lot more about jurisdiction, how the ICC operates, what rights it provides, et cetera, later today. So
I think that response was worth a lot more than 2 cents. That was really helpful. Thank you. Adia, go ahead.
So this was just something brought up in the chat that I wanted to ask a bit more generally, is this idea that the president would be the one who receives all the blame if convicted by the ICC. I just wanted to clarify a question. Would it be the president or his entire cabinet as well as those under him? Or like how would that process occur? Because again, I know we're being lectured on ICC later, so this might be a question for later, but it's just who exactly would be impeached in this scenario? And could we run the argument that the effects of being impeached, whoever next is in power, could be worse?
So first of all, Greta, let me say something real quick, and then I'm going to give you the floor. Okay, 2 things. First of all, we're not talking about impeachment here. We're talking about criminal prosecution with the ICC. Okay. But secondly, I believe, and I'm going to ask Greta to clarify this or correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I believe that the ICC is sort of a court of last resort. Like the initial presumption is that the nation itself will prosecute such criminal wrongdoing itself, and the ICC steps in when there is no movement toward justice in the home nation, right? So go ahead, Greta, please.
Again, I'm gonna get into this later. One thing I would say, just overarching for all of you on the ICC, don't get too into the nitty-gritty. It's really confusing. You're never going to be able to explain it to your judge in 6 minutes how this court works. It's the same thing with like the US legal system. You can't school someone on law in 6 minutes in criminal procedure. But what I will say is, number one, yes, it's a court of last resort. It's when domestic court systems fail to prosecute for crimes that the ICC steps in. And secondarily, the ICC doesn't just prosecute like presidents. So I know that there was some talk in the chat about like the president and who would be prosecuted.
Right.
Like there have been like if you look at the list of open cases that the ICC has had, they've handled 32 total cases since their initiation in 2002. They have more warrants out than that, but it's 32 total cases that have actually gone to trial or gone to the pretrial stage. There's presidents, militia leaders, high-ranking military officials, low-ranking military officials, lawyers, attorneys, like they've prosecuted a lot of different kinds of people. It's not always presidents or country leaders. It's people that are directly related to the crime that is being prosecuted. That can be anyone. Usually it's somebody that has some sort of rank or power, but it's not always like the president of a country. And so if the US was being prosecuted for committing a war crime, the president might be involved. The president might not also be involved. It might be a military leader. It might be somebody that was stationed overseas. Like we don't really know. But I will get into more of that later. So if any of you have more questions about like the ICC, the way it operates, jurisdiction, that sort of thing, hold them. And we can talk about all of that at one.
All right. Thank you.
Danielle, go ahead.
Okay, this isn't specifically like pertaining. I mean, I guess it's kind of like the ICC, but it's more of like just a potential like app argument more than like its jurisdictions, etc. So, could you potentially run something about like we know how the United States, the ICC handles like war crimes. You know how the United States military soldiers have had like human rights violations in foreign countries such as like Afghanistan, Iraq. Could you run something on that about app and like how the ICC would address that?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I don't see why not, right? I think on app, I mean, you could certainly, use those examples, right? There's one from the 1960s as well. It took place in Vietnam, called the My Lai incident, right? Where a lot of US soldiers basically they did horrific things in a village called My Lai in Vietnam. And the U.S. justice system completely failed to bring, the entirety of military command to account for that. There was just one lieutenant named William Calley who was set up as the fall guy for that, and he was the only one who was ever prosecuted, right? So you could actually show failures of the United States in dealing with situations like this and how the ICC would be better. So absolutely.
Real fast. So if I bring up like a past crime or something, they just mentioned it in the chat that like the ICC, like for example, Vietnam, right? The people who probably committed that are probably older. So like would the United or would the ICC be able to prosecute that? If not, then I could just say like they would be able to prevent further human rights violations from happening.
So I think the argument would be these are examples of things where participation in the ICC would have produced a more just result, right? I think that's where I'd go with that. And I don't want to get too much deeper into this because as Greta said, she is going to be presenting on this in a little while. So I'm going to try to listen to Greta's presentation because I think it's going to be really valuable. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to move on. And this is like my last recommendation to you all, right? Is that you consider including some sort of a thesis statement in the framework. Because I think you're linking your contention level analysis and your advocacy throughout the debate back to your framework is going to be super important on this resolution, right? it's a great way to signpost for your judge exactly how you are impacting this resolution, right? So, for example, right, I just gave two, like, pulled out of the air examples. The affirmative thesis that is that the failure of the U.S. to enter into treaties such as UNCLOS and the ICC diminishes the respected standing of the U.S. in the global community and threatens U.S. global leadership, right? So there you would have some sort of a framework that basically says that U.S. global leadership is a really good thing, right? And participation in these treaties is going to strengthen that, okay? Or on the negative, right? The negative thesis is that the standards of treaties such as UNCLOS and ICC are below those guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. Thus, entering into these treaties will diminish justice both in the U.S. and the world. Again, with the caveat of what Greta said, which is that if you're going to make a constitutionality argument, you need to decide if that's the hill that you want to raise your flag on, right? That the U.S. Constitution is a very flawed document in many ways. Go ahead, Adia.
So this is kind of a question that links back to wealth tax. Like we had Nozick's and we had more libertarianism arguments on the neg that were a bit more extreme in terms of framework. Are there common frameworks like that we could see on the neg?
Well, I think that the more extreme frameworks that you might see on the neg might be things like nationalism, right? Isolationism, things like that, right? We're not talking here about personal liberties or personal justice. We're talking about national actions. So I think that like clearly, I guess what I'd say to you on that is that clearly the incoming administration has some very isolationist and protectionist perspectives that they are bringing to the table and that they are going to be bringing into the next government, right? So at least for some people in the United States, those ideas have some resonance, okay? So I think that you could hear some more isolationist type arguments on the neg. Personally, I think that those extremely isolationist arguments are weak, but that's my personal perspective, right? Maybe somebody's going to come up with a really brilliant isolationist argument here. Okay. All right. Any other questions before we move along? Danielle, go ahead.
Okay. So my coach mentioned something about running something along like the realms of like Immanuel Kant, but she also like did PF and she doesn't really know much about framework. So I was just going to ask you, like kind of how she said, could you do something about the categorical imperative, something within means to an end, or like something within like autonomy, anything like that?
So I haven't thought about that yet. Okay. My gut reaction is that it would be hard to make an autonomy argument because when we're talking about autonomy, we're normally talking about personal autonomy, right? However, using people as means to an end, I don't know. Who's got Greta? You have an idea on that?
What I would say is that on this topic, personally, I think that there are much better frameworks that you can run than Kant. I think that's pretty common on a lot of topics. I don't want to say I'm a Kant hater. I just think Kant's really confusing. I think that most of the debaters that try to run Kant don't fully understand Kant because Kant wrote works that for some reason are just absolutely terrible to read. I think that there's better things that you can run on this topic. The other thing I would say is that when Kant initially wrote the categorical imperative, it's not a maxim that's meant to relate to government action. It's about interpersonal relationships and the morality of human relationships. But the categorical imperative was never intentionally made to be extrapolated to the actions of a government. It's not a government maxim. Kant has theory on government. He wrote on government, but his theory on government is not the same as the theory that he wrote on the categorical imperative. And so I would maybe stray away from trying to use the categorical imperative as a way to frame the actions of a government as opposed to a person. Alandria might have something more on that.
Yeah, I agree with Greta's take. I do think that you can. Like there is a avenue that you can, because it does imply that moral implication that you should do something. But as Greta pointed out, like Kant specific writing is to that interpersonal like relations. It's not about government entities. However, there is a way to apply it. As Greta said, there's the governmental ways. And if you want to be that debater that genuinely wants to apply this, I think there's room for that creativity within debate, saying that like the United States has a categorical imperative to like join UNCLOS or the ICC because of this, isn't this, all of the human rights violations, saying like we cannot justly deal with this in our country. We need the ICC to step in, things of that nature. However, I do think like with the ICC, like using something like justice or something more governmental relations related would be helpful. If you really want to use the categorical imperative, I would recommend using it as an additional argument and not necessarily your framework. So having like you have your main framework and your value framework, but then like maybe in case as like evidence or like as a block, you'd be like Kant re-emphasizes this idea that whatever philosophy you have, like he emphasizes this with the categorical imperative. So you now have this philosophical addition to your case and argumentation. And that's what I would recommend if you are dead set on using Kant in the categorical imperative.
Okay, so Adia, Thomas, and Danielle, I know you guys are really eager to start developing your case ideas, but we do want to give you guys a little break, and you're going to have plenty of opportunity to get those questions asked and addressed by people who are really experienced